Welcome to Conversations Different, a podcast of the Santa Fe New Mexican, focusing on interesting people and issues of northern New Mexico. This is Inez Russell Gomez. This week we are talking to Ben Baker, Public Safety Advisor to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. He's going to speak with us about the special legislative session on public safety. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much, Inez. Pleasure to be here.
So you said before we opened that last night you were in Portales with the cabinet on the road where the governor goes with some of her top people talking to ordinary citizens about what they care about. And one of the things you heard from people is that they care about public safety.
Absolutely, that's right. We were in Portales and Clovis both for the last 48 hours. And it's cabinet in your community. And what we do is take the entire cabinet, so the entire leadership team, to people's communities, offer them robust state services in a fair type setting, and then we host a town hall subsequent to that and open up the floor to the governor and the entirety of the cabinet to the citizenry of the community. And we heard a lot about public safety.
What did they think that the state could do, particularly through this legislative session, to make their lives safer?
Many things were discussed, and I'll touch on a couple of them. One of the things that seemed increasingly important in both communities was how the government handles persons experiencing significant mental health crises or people who are experiencing substance abuse disorder or both simultaneously. And some of the proposed solutions from the governor's perspective that we'd like to see changed in the laws, increasing the ability to be able to get those folks from where they are handled now, which is largely when they intersect with the criminal justice system, which we do not feel is the most effective methodology for treating people, to a place where they can be brought to treatment and brought to help. And there seemed to be significant interest from not only community members, but municipal, local, and county officials, on the government side, as well as the public safety side, including representatives from the corrections side that talked about exactly what we see in communities closer here to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, which is folks are getting their treatment for mental health disorders in the jail.
Yeah, and that, as we know, doesn't work very well.
No, ma'am, that's right.
So there's been a pushback from kind of social services groups, people who deal with the unhoused, people who deal with mentally ill people and substance abuse people, that yes, there needs to be more attention to those groups, but what the governor is suggesting isn't as well thought out as they think it should be. So I know there was a bigger change in the law going to be proposed, and that's been pushed back a little bit to what you're talking about for this session. So why don't we talk about what the governor's proposing in terms of helping commit people or help them get treatment even if they're not ready for it in their own minds?
Certainly, no, and that's a good summary. The way in which this entire topic is handled is a pretty old body of law and has been relatively untouched for a good number of years. And that's probably contributed to some of the atrophy that we see in the ability of the system to catch up to what the evolving needs are within our communities. So what we're really talking about is two distinctive things, and one of them I'll refer to as criminal competency. And that's a legal doctrine. That's a practical definition that I'll explain in a minute. And the other is called involuntary commitment. And those are two separate and distinctive things. Criminal competency has to do with whether or not when any citizen, interacts with the criminal justice system and is charged with a crime. And it's irrespective of what the crime is, from the kind of seemingly least significant petty misdemeanor to the most significant capital degree felony, a core constitutional component of one's ability to be able to defend themselves in the due process system criminally is competency. If competency is raised by the defense and determination is made that that person is not competent to stand trial, we have an extraordinarily narrow window with which to do anything. And I will tell you what happens. We're talking about 16,000 cases in New Mexico since 2017. And so significant number of criminal cases, so individual charges over a prolonged period of time, varying all the way from petty misdemeanor crimes like criminal trespass all the way to capital offenses and significant violent crimes committed against persons. The methodology and the most likely outcome historically is those folks have their charges dismissed because that is not the correct tool to treat a person who is not competent, and their case is dismissed.
So that means if I am mentally ill and I shoot my neighbor for whatever reason, and it's determined that I am incompetent, then they say you're incompetent and off I go.
Right, with the highest probability, and that is what we see is the huge gap that exists within the system, because competency, by definition, is something that can be restored, and it is a thing that is either present or absent at the time that you are interfacing with the criminal justice system. So it's not something that's inflexible. It changes over time, just like human beings do. And what's critical about that is we have seen, and I hesitate to use the word revolving door, but we see a frequent reoccurrence where we'll have somebody interacting with the criminal justice system 50 times in a calendar year. And I'll tell you a really important example from a law enforcement perspective, which is one of the views that I feel like I can see because of some of my experiences, is the police officer that responds to the person standing in front of a New Mexico business with their shirt off, screaming at people, throwing food,
Yep.
urinating or defecating in public, whatever the thing that they may be doing that is criminal by nature, the police officer is who is called. That is who we as a society call the police. They arrive to deal with this problem. They see a crime, like in the example I just gave, and the remedy for that is interface with the criminal justice system, ride to jail, an arraignment with a judge. Competency isn't determined way down the line. At the point of sale, at the point of interface where the police officer interacts with that citizen, the next time or the 80th time, he or she does not know the person's relative competency at that time. Therefore, there is no avoiding the entire process. And what that means is I've seen the data and looked at the faces of the folks that are getting booked over and over again. They go into this system for a criminal offense. They are there for a very short period of time. Competency is determined. They are released and they return for very similar criminal conduct ad infinitum.
Because they're incompetent. Okay, so what the governor is proposing is something that would send them where? Where would they go instead?
Sure. So the bill would require that judges order district attorneys to consider the filing of involuntary commitment. And we'll talk a little bit about commitment in a minute because that outcome is the same. But right now we're talking about criminal competency, right? Filing for involuntary commitment and gives the judge the ability to detain the defendant for up to 7 days for that process and that petition to be initiated. The point of that whole process is to determine what treatment modalities can be used, assessment by a licensed medical professional about what is the situation that this person is experiencing that causes them to be in this state. The judge would be required to hold the defendant for up to 7 days, and the DA is required to file a petition for involuntary civil commitment under at least one of the following three circumstances. So if one of these exists, then we talk about escalating that kind of shall piece of that, a felony involving the use of a firearm. So the example that you gave hypothetically, of course, of somebody shooting their neighbor. If that person were incompetent, once that determination was made, this is what we would want to see. A defendant who has been found incompetent 2 or more times during the previous 12 months. So again, the example that I gave, which is the recycled person within the criminal justice system, which we believe is ineffective at treating people for particularly significant mental health disorders.
Okay. We will take a quick break and be back in a moment with Conversations Different.
Thanks, Inez. This is Patrick Dorsey, publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Conversations Different with Inez Russell Gomez. Great local content is only possible with a talented staff dedicated to bringing you the best local content possible. For that staff to do its work, we need your support by subscribing to the Santa Fe New Mexican. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. And if not, there's never been a better time to subscribe. In addition to our home-delivered newspaper that comes with full digital access, we also provide digital-only subscriptions for SantaFeNewMexican.com. We'll also be releasing more online-only audio and video programming moving forward. The Santa Fe New Mexican has been here for nearly 175 years, and we want to continue being your source for local news and information. Visit us at SantaFeNewMexican.com/subscribe or call us at 505-986-3010. Thank you.
It's a new day in New Mexico, and the doors to boundless opportunity are open as tens of thousands of New Mexicans reach higher to pursue a dream, broaden their horizons, and retrain for a better job. With the New Mexico Lottery and Opportunity Scholarships, you could build yourself a better future anywhere in the state. You put in the hard work, we'll help with the costs. For eligibility details, visit reachhighernm.com.
We are back talking to Ben Baker about public safety. Let's go back to the things you were talking about in terms of how a person could be criminally committed. The worry I've heard from activists, for the mentally ill and for the unhoused, is that there's no place to treat them. So where will you commit them to?
Certainly, and I think that's a commonly held, misunderstood thing that has become kind of lore and fact for some folks. Our Secretary of the Healthcare Authority, which used to be obviously Health and Human Services, Carrie Armijo, testified last week in front of the interim committee of the Courts, Corrections, and Justice Committee to some really important data points and facts. We have recovered over 70% of the mental health care providers within our state. What we are finding in a very broad stroke, and I won't try and get into the minutiae of that because I'm far from an expert related to the facilities. What I will tell you, though, is that our belief is we have made significant progress in recovery to previous administration's cut and removal of those things. Our belief is that the services exist. They are not being used in voluntary ways. We believe that there will be no logjam of folks having an absence of ability to treatment. We believe we have restored those services to folks. What we're having trouble finding right now is people are not seeking those voluntarily.
Okay, so there's also, from what I hear, a concern that if I'm not ready to seek treatment, let's say I'm an addict and I'm stealing to fund my drug habit, if I'm not ready for substance abuse treatment, does it work? So you're going to send people to treatment against their will, and it's going to be just a waste of time and effort.
Well, I think you make a valid point, and this particularly substance abuse treatment is a thing that I hold very close to my own kind of experience and heart. So I will tell you that I do think willingness and acceptance are a really key component to recovery from substance abuse, and so I do think that is important. However, I will tell you, I watch from a place where I have access to the data, a place that how we're handling the folks that are affected this way now is not kind, it is not compassionate, it is not helpful, and it is not restorative to them to a condition where they can have a full life and contribute. Because what we want to see is people recover.
Right.
There's no interest in criminalizing folks that are experiencing these issues. In fact, my position and my observation is that fewer of these folks in the jail, and when we pivot to some of the other topics, an increase of the correct folks in the jail will drastically improve New Mexico's public safety, is that we're using the jail to treat folks where that methodology doesn't work. So I will tell you that I can't solve the willingness to substance abuse problem. What I can tell you is that we haven't tried a methodology that involves creating, because there is a school of thought and there is practical use within the profession about folks that create exigency for folks, and that sometimes is the impetus for the willingness to evolve. And
so you're going to give them an opportunity to get better. It might start against their will, but they're going to be in the system and maybe they can change.
Absolutely. The goal to all of these is the least restrictive methodology that can be imposed by the court is what we're going for under every circumstance. And that's why there's differentiation between folks who have, used violence and folks that have not. That is an important delineation. Yes,
right. And again, going back to the idea of criminal versus non-criminal, if you're a family member, let's say, and you have an adult child who is dangerous to themselves, perhaps, and, again, an addict, maybe they're trying to steal money from their grandma, all the things that happen in our lives, this gives you a chance to go to the court and seek help for them that they're not going to seek themselves.
Absolutely, and this is the perfect transition to our involuntary commitment proposed legislation. Broadens the definitions of what it means to be a danger to self and others within the involuntary commitment statute. So instead of trying to undertake the entire thing, it's adjusting the definitions in there to meet the things that we are experiencing. And the intent of this is to make it clear to practitioners in the court that some people fall within an entire spectrum of needs. Some people simply will fall into a kind of a grave passive neglect and are putting themselves in literally danger, but they're not harming anyone else.
Right.
So the goal is to help them. The goal is not to keep other people safe from them. And so the spectrum that you describe, all the way from stealing from inside your family to acting out with violence to grave passive neglect, are contemplated. And the goal is to find the least restrictive methodology and treatment that will help that person to recover.
So the idea is to offer the community more tools to help their neighbors,
Absolutely.
basically.
More tools, more ability to be more broadening of like how that can begin. And then I think extending that community to the part that's really critical in here, which is the court. The court having the tool to actually make a choice that isn't something like, well, I know this person needs our help, but let's turn them loose, because that's not a tool that we really have at our disposal right now.
Another criticism I have heard is that there's not enough judges. The courts are packed anyway. Do you have the people to handle however many commitments or proposed criminal charges with mental illness as a side deal? Is there enough systematic work, to handle this?
I remain, that's a great question, and I remain optimistic, and I'll tell you why, because the system capacity in all of our systems, whether the school system, the jail, hospitals, kind of regardless of what the mechanism, particularly when it interacts with the government and bureaucracy, that's always a piece. I have watched the County of Bernalillo's jail adjust to an increased flux of arresting of violent offenders. I've watched them increase their capacity and work on ways, inter-system within the courts, within the police department, within the district attorney's office, to adjust to demands as they need. And I have no doubt that will exist elsewhere. The legislature just passed a law, we just went into effect a few months ago, that determines whether or not a person is eligible to be held without bond if they reoffend when they're on conditions of release. That has had an impact already on our jail populations, because people do reoffend, and the legislature saw fit to kind of isolate those folks and tweak that language. And I watch a incremental uptick in the population of the jail. I think that what we'll have to do is we'll have to see. And then one of the key components of this is if we do nothing, if we build nothing, if we try nothing, we can expect the continued worsening vector that we are on now is my expectation. And I've watched for nearly 30 years our community suffer from many of these problems. And so I remain optimistic that the systems will be robust enough to be assistive, and that folks will assimilate to things. And
in one instance, there would be less pressure on the jails, because they wouldn't be the holding cell for mental health patients or for addicts and those kinds of things. So it might relieve part of the system in a way. Absolutely. And I will tell you from personal observation in many of our jails, which have become very intimately aware of kind of who's in there and for what, as we're trying to examine this, for holding the wrong folks. And we believe folks who are experiencing mental health crises or folks who are substance abuse addicted that have, nonviolent criminality to support a drug addiction like you stated earlier. That's not the correct methodology for them to recover. And it is not the best use of that facility when we know that we have a violence and a gun problem that's existing at the same time. Right. So absolutely. So going from the kind of nuts and bolts of what the governor's proposing in this area, do you have the votes to get it passed, especially considering you had 80 groups saying, don't have this session, and those people obviously have support in the legislature as well? Yeah, no, I think that I have heard and read all of the things that you have and have seen, what that looks like. But I also have got to tour around our state and meet with community members with frequency during the spring and summer. And there were more than 80 people in attendance at the places that I just came from. And so my expectation is that the voice of New Mexico will be heard, and the support of what folks feel like will help move the needle on increasing our public safety and treating people with the dignity and compassion they want. I had the opportunity to interact with a homelessness expert from Houston, Texas, 2 weeks ago, and I drove them around our largest city. And having had 30 years of experience in her case in a huge city, her reactions to what we are experiencing and her feedback on what we ought to be able to do to change that trajectory really gave me hope and inspired that we are going to get support on these things. Yes. Well, that's really encouraging. You should write a My View about that experience. We run them in the paper, and that would be really interesting, because I know Houston has done some really important things in terms of dealing with homelessness. That's right. That's what I've read anyway. These aren't the only things that are up for discussion during this session. There are a couple of other measures, if you could maybe just briefly go over them. Sure, and I'll start with felon in possession of firearm, because that is something that not only that I'm passionate about, but I know a lot about, and I think it could be helpful to your audience about what the point is. So, okay.
When you say the words felon in possession of a firearm, what you are saying is that a person has previously been convicted of a felony crime and is no longer permitted in any state of the union or federally to possess firearms. But yet in New Mexico, we have an epidemic of reoccurrence. And I say reoccurrence because it is not easy work to become a convicted felon. You have to work. Then you must ignore the orders of the court, the order of the law of the land, and choose to pick up a gun. We are seeing a significant rise in the frequency with which people are being charged with the crime of felon in possession in New Mexico. We are also seeing a huge rise in the frequency with which people are using guns to solve problems in our communities. Guns and felons do not mix. It is a very straightforward and simple proposal. Several of the last murders committed against police officers in New Mexico are committed by people who are felons in possession of a firearm. A person was sentenced in federal court today for shooting a New Mexico State Police lieutenant. We are asking to raise the criminal punishment for this very distinctive and select group of folks so that they are spending an appropriate amount of time of jail, given that this is not a first offense, given that they are put on extraordinary notice, and given what a high risk this is to the community.
Right.
So we want to see more time.
So it's not a preventive probably, because if you're a crook and you like guns, you're going to keep doing it, but it just means you punish them and take them away from the street.
I will tell you, I have hesitated to use the word punishment, but I don't think you're wrong at all. Yeah. There are multiple reasons that the criminal justice system exists. Prevention is one of them.
Yeah.
Prohibition from reoffending within the community is one of them too. And some people can call that punishment, but segregation so that, because the instances
you make everybody safe because that person is a rat and you don't want them around.
You cannot reoffend and be a felon in possession of a firearm from inside the penitentiary. It is literally impossible.
I love that. On that note, we'll take a quick break and be back with Conversations Different in a moment.
My name is Maria Jose Rodriguez Cadiz, and I am the Executive Director with Solace Sexual Assault Services. Our mission is to prevent sexual violence and empower survivors of sexual violence through restoring dignity, strength, and resiliency. For almost 51 years, Solace has reduced the impact of sexual violence. We do it by focusing on human rights, social justice, hope, and dignity. We believe survivors are experts in their own experiences and acknowledge that empowering them is crucial to their healing. Our advocacy, forensic interviewing, and therapy services are centered to their needs. Our sexual violence prevention programs in schools and community is just as important. Please check our website at findsolace.org. And if in need, you can call our 24/7 hotline, which is 800-721-7273. Your support is crucial to the lives of survivors. Thank you. Gracias.
We are back with Ben Baker, Public Safety Advisor to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. Let's talk really briefly about the proposal to keep people off medians, which may or may not be unconstitutional depending on how the Supreme Court keeps ruling and what people think, because it's being written as a public safety measure. My question is, yes, we have the worst pedestrian deaths in the country, but very few of them, if any, are connected to people standing on medians. It's more about people darting into traffic. Or do you have numbers to contradict that? Well, because everyone I've asked says, well, we don't really have the numbers. We think so.
Right. Well, so excellent point, and whoever is giving that information, I think, is correct. I've been a police officer for a really long time. We don't know what the person was doing precisely before they were hit by a car and die. I've only seen one pedestrian hit in my career. I've responded to literally hundreds of pedestrians hit by cars. You almost never see it. And as time evolves and as cameras are more present, there probably is more data. That is not a collectible item. When a person is hit by a car, by a New Mexico driver who, let's say, is otherwise not doing anything illegal, that's not a criminal investigation.
Right.
So it's not categorized as a crime. It's not investigated as a crime. It's a tragic accident, particularly if the person is seriously injured or dies, which happens way too frequently, as you mentioned, in New Mexico. So I would respectfully submit to anybody, and have debated this with folks who somewhat oppose some of these proposals, is nobody knows, is my perspective, but maybe more importantly than that, I'm not sure that it matters, because it is unnecessary, in my opinion, in our view, for New Mexico to continue to lead. It is unnecessary to put people in places. When I was driving around with our Houston guest, took a picture of a person standing on a median that was no more than 6 inches wide and several times tripping into traffic.
Yeah.
What that person was doing, what's in their hands, and what is coming out of their mouth is not contemplated within the context of this legislation. It has no respect to what the person is trying to communicate. We are not trying to ban panhandling. People are going to be free to panhandle in places that are not designated to fairly well. And that will remain handled by,
money is speech.
by municipalities and other places. What we are trying to do is keep New Mexicans safer.
Okay, and I hear that. One of the worries that people have expressed to me is that interactions between police and people who are unhoused is not always the most productive, in part because maybe officers don't have as much training as they need to de-escalate. You don't know if that homeless person who seems, innocent or whatever has a big knife and is going to kill you. I mean, it's a dangerous situation, and they're worried about increasing interactions and say that's a way for more people to get hurt.
Well, so I respect folks' perceptions on that, and I will raise kind of both sides because I want to be fair. I had a police officer murdered by an unhoused person during a police interaction. It was completely unprovoked. So to half of your point. And then we have had the opposite of that. And what I think we've seen, and I'll take the New Mexico State Police as a great example. Some of our other municipal police departments are doing equally good work. Every single police officer in New Mexico State Police is comprehensively trained as a crisis intervention officer. And let me tell you, I was a police officer when that training methodology was invented. And it used to be fractional percentages, like specialists, like 5% of your department, and then it crept up as time. Now, 100%. You aren't going to call the police and not get a person who is precisely trained on how to deal with folks who are experiencing these situations. And again, I want to reiterate that the goal of any of this legislation is not to criminalize either being unhoused, being mentally ill, or being substance abuse addicted at all. What we're seeing happen, though, is that these things, public safety and people experiencing homelessness, intersect with astounding frequency. The tools that we currently have to address that, the men and women that we send out in their uniforms say, hey, go protect and serve this public. We don't give them a viable outlet to an outcome. And so I have, acting as the law enforcement director and working in law enforcement capacity, I have absolute confidence that not only are our police officers striving to be professional servants of the public and stewards of people's constitutional rights, I believe, not only from my own experience, but from many of my colleagues, the goal is to target the folks who use violence against our community. And if our efforts were directed to that and less towards these things, less towards worrying about whether or not we had, hundreds of unhoused people within four city blocks in some of our communities, if those folks were in a methodology that could recover them to treatment, sustainability and a better, less intersection with public safety and criminal justice life, that's the goal here. And so I have a hard time, hypothesizing on what could happen when we increase the community, because that almost sounds like, well, don't call. Like, we don't want the police to come, but yet there is no one else to call.
No,
to that. The police are the people who are coming.
No, we have alternative response units now in Santa Fe, so that's giving them extra tools to deal with crises.
Those buffers. I love those. Yeah. I think those are exceptionally good tools because, again, the goal should not be a trip to jail. The goal to this interaction should not be a trip to jail. But all of the experts that we have spoken to on this topic and all of the experts that have had success in big cities like Houston and Los Angeles, there must be an accountability ceiling measure that has to be held. And we're talking about a petty misdemeanor. So the significance of this criminal offense is already as low as humanly possible within a state, because the goal is not to see a person incarcerated.
It's to get them off the medians.
To get them in a place where they're not going to be hit and killed by a car.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. We have newspaper vendors on medians, so it's always, they haven't fallen into the street yet. So I think they're on ones that are not as small as the ones you guys are talking about, though. And finally, the last one is like the most sensible one that I've read, because it says everyone has to report their crime statistics. Right. And the first thing you think about is everyone's not reporting their crime statistics.
Yeah, so it's a complex thing. Our public health order that the governor declared back in September of last year really has done some things to educate us and the community about where we stand. So we have great police officers and great government officials doing great work, great treatment facilities, all these things. There are silos within all of our systems that exist, and law enforcement is no different. And sharing of information to inform not only the executive, but the legislative body, anybody who's formulating or contemplating policy and strategy moves going forward, is the goal of this. Is we want to have contemporary information that's available quickly on things. Like, and one of the additions to this that I think is significant has to do with ballistic information. And it's, at this point, loosely defined. Ballistic information can mean a lot of things. And that's intentional, because the technology that exists today is not the technology that existed 20 or 30 years ago as it relates to how crimes are used or how criminal investigations are done using technology.
Okay.
Some communities don't have the capability or the access to that. But that doesn't mean that the policymakers statewide shouldn't be able to understand the trends. Where are we seeing escalations of, let's say, gunshots? Where are we seeing escalation of shell casings or gun tracing, where you have trafficking of guns from one part of the state to another where they're being used in other criminal conduct? The other place, and I'll just mention this really quickly out of time, this is permeating significantly our young people. Their intersection with guns is not, so don't think that we don't know that this is happening and that we are not paying distinct attention to this. We are seeing a rise in that is unprecedented in my observation time. The reason why that's important is there's only a couple classifications of folks: felons, people who are mentally unstable, and children who are not permitted Second Amendment rights under guns. Children are getting guns with far too much frequency. I've had my own very personal experiences with that very recently, with my oldest son almost being shot in a park by a child.
Oh, dear.
And a child was shot at that park during that incident. But that opened my eyes to the reality we're facing. There are far too many young people, over 200 people since the public health order has been in place, have been charged and arrested with a crime involving a firearm. And that's people under the age of 18. The leading cause of death in New Mexico for people under 18 is firearms related. Yep. I was protecting my kids against fentanyl and car crashes.
Right.
Firearms, we're going to get them. And so I think focusing our attention on felons, keeping other New Mexicans safe, putting folks into places where they can recover and have a more whole life is the correct direction to go. Focusing attention on folks who have already demonstrated that they have no respect for the laws related to their ability to possess firearms are a great target area for folks who are also willing to traffic those firearms to our young people. So those are some of the goals.
That makes sense. And one of the things I've read over and over is that a very few criminals are responsible for a lot of the problem. So if you can lock those people up, maybe you'll have much less of a problem.
Well, how about the resources that you could spend in helping the other folks and making the community safe and proactive things? Absolutely agree 100%. Pre-pandemic, 1,400 felon in possession firearms cases charged in a given calendar year, let's say 17 and 18. A complete drop-off during the pandemic timeframe for obvious reasons. People were not getting charged with crimes, period. Doesn't mean they weren't occurring. Last year, we returned to the near 1,400. This year, at the end of May, which is the data I have, we are well on pace to increase that by 30%. It will be our largest number of felon in possession crime charges in recent history. The reason why that's significant is because at some point, that's one a day. Bernalillo County, a person is getting arrested a day for being in a felon in possession of a firearm. You would think you'd run out of the pool. If they were spending time in the penitentiary, you would start to see that pool thin out, and that's the goal.
So that's the goal, is to get him off the streets.
Yes, ma'am.
Just one quick kind of summation. Do you think, obviously it's not just what the governor, it is what the governor wants because it's special session, but there's going to be a lot of push from Republicans to, do border bills because that's a public safety concern of theirs. What other things do you think might come up that either will cloud what you're going to try to do in a couple of days or just be pushed aside till the general legislative session in January? That's
a great question, Inez, and I'm not sure. I know that the office has received a number of proposals from legislatures on expressing to the governor interest in wanting to see this in with a special session. And I will tell you, those things are being contemplated and those decisions are being made. Obviously, it is not time yet, and I'm not going to be the authority on what those things will be in or out. But what I hope happens is that folks really do like what I watched leadership from municipalities do when engaged with these homelessness experts, is start to polarize their focus on the things that we actually can move the needle on, focus the entirety of the system's attention on those things that we agree need help. Because I have not run into a New Mexican yet that doesn't think we're suffering a mental health crisis or a violent crime crisis. And so keeping the things narrow enough to put the full force and attention of all those capable legislators and the executive to get that the best thing to the New Mexico voters is the goal. And then also it will stimulate, any of those ideas will stimulate absolutely the launching point for a successful 60-day session where we can pack more in because we'll have put in some of the work. So I'm anxious to look forward to what that looks like.
And you'll have some results. It'll either work or it won't work.
That's right.
The other thing that always bothers me, just as someone who likes statistics and numbers, the reality is in the country that crime peaked in the late 90s, got way better, then spiked again during the pandemic and is actually going down. Why do people feel so unsafe when, if you look at statistics, we're not as criminally, overrun as we think sometimes?
Right. No, I think so. Perception is reality. And I will tell you, as a person who's policed in every corner of our state, it does feel less safe. And when I took guests around to show them some of the things that we're experiencing, I was reminded that when I'm standing at a park at my son's football practice and a 13-year-old shoots another child in front of me, I'm reminded of that. So the frequency which results in the stat is not nearly as impactful as the thing. Have you ever met a person who's had their car stolen?
Yeah.
Sure you have. How about a house burglarized, right? How about somebody who's experienced rampant shoplifting while they're literally paying for the thing that the other person is walking out the door with? The perception is the reality. And quite frankly, I don't think New Mexican citizens care too much about what the stats say. They want to feel better. And I agree with them. So do I.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. I always say crime has gone down because we got burglarized 3 times, like about 15 years ago, and nothing since. I got a really big dog and put wire around my house, and so far so good. But it is funny, though, when you feel unsafe, but it's not necessarily true. But it is true for you. So So how do you fix that?
Well, I think one of the things that's critical, that's absolutely critical and something we need to return to, that was something we did really well in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then shortages of person power, I think has slowed some of our police departments down. Our law enforcement folks need to be proactively in their communities. And that doesn't mean arresting people. In fact, arresting people is a necessity in very specific circumstances. You're a community member. I had a training officer teach me a really long time ago that you can't quantify prevention, but you know when you have failed to achieve it. And you failed to achieve it when you're responding to the house that has the door kicked in because you were doing something other than patrolling that neighborhood. Yeah. And getting folks interested in public service, calling on our young folks to come join us to see these things as honorable professions, whether it's in social work, whether it's at CYFD, whether it's in our corrections field, whether it's a first responder, whether it's a teacher. Getting folks engaged in that community, getting these folks out into, instead of being responsive. If you call the police now, a lot of the experience I hear from New Mexicans is you're waiting for hours because they are going from one crisis to the next and they've stacked up. Well, your quality of life thing will become pretty deprioritized. And that's not making you feel any better about the service that you're getting. And that's probably to no fault to the actual people putting in the work. It's the fault of the fact that we can't handle the load. So if crime has gone down and if the statistics are to be believed, the system sure doesn't reflect it, and I don't think people's perceptions reflect it. And so I think the way we reverse that is we have to get our people out from under responding to, arresting the same person who's not competent to stand trial 100 times is a really good place to start freeing up people's power to respond to other things, particularly proactively, particularly to quality of life issues, particularly to get ahead of things. I was driving home from the south and kind of east part of our state last night, and I was driving through 2 very small communities, and I saw police officers monitoring traffic during a storm for either safety or speeding or both.
Nice.
And it was nice to see because I don't see that much.
No, we don't get speeding tickets, knock on wood,
there's not
very
a whole
much.
lot. There's not a whole lot of that. And, and again, part of that has to do with how we feel. If you feel like there's no one present to watch you, not only the good folks that are trying to live their lives and raise their families and run their businesses understand it, I think so do the criminals. And when the criminals are free to roam around, I think that we have lost some of what we're trying to do as a society, which is to help keep people safe and help hold people accountable when they run afoul, which happens.
That's fair. If you don't have consequences, then you just keep doing what you're doing.
I think that's right.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll be back next week with another Conversations Different.